Father Christie, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing I'd like to say is what a wonderful experience it has been for me and for my wife, Finola, to be at the Eucharistic Congress. The sense of warmth and camaraderie that existed and exists between all the people who've been here has to have been a tremendous encouragement to anybody. We realise when we come here that we're not alone in professing our faith. We're not alone in celebrating. And this was a week of celebration. We're not alone in celebrating our faith. And I think that this brings us back to something that the Holy Father said not so long ago. And in fact, in the paper he wrote on evangelization, he said, "In search of truth, he who trusts only in his individual actions and does not recognize the help of others is deceiving himself." In other words, we all need to help one another to sustain ourselves, each the other, in our faith. And in light of that recognition that our faith is a social activity, it's not an individual piety, it's something that we do together as Catholics and as Christians. What I'd like to develop is the idea of what does the Eucharist mean for us, obviously as individuals, in families, in communities, and what does it mean for us to the extent that we involve ourselves in political activity or try to influence political activity. Secondly, I'm going to assert that Christians and Catholics have not just a right, but an obligation to engage themselves in politics to the extent that they can. And thirdly, I'm going to assert that what we as committed Christians can do in politics can bring a great deal of added value to political activity, not just for people who share our point of view, but for believers as well, and non-believers as well as believers. For us, as Catholics, everything really in our faith experience begins with the Eucharist. It's the source of our belief, and it should also be the motive for our engagement with other people. Catholic Christianity is Eucharistic Christianity. And for the Catholic in the street, so to speak, everything really starts with the Eucharist. As the Second Vatican Council said, the Eucharist is the source and the summit of Christian life. It casts light on how we are to live. And the very word communion means a coming together of people. The word said in the consecration, "This is my body, this is my blood," and the invitation to take and eat that we hear, each of us, some of you probably every day, me at least once a week. Those words that we hear come from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And I think if you go to read that letter, which many of you will have done, you find a deeper understanding of what communion and the celebration of the Eucharist is really all about. These words are actually, which are quoted in the letter, verbatim as they're said on the altar. These words are preceded a paragraph or so earlier in this letter that St. Paul wrote to the people of Corinth by a few words telling off the people in Corinth about how they were making mistakes in the way that they were celebrating the Eucharist. As we know, the Lord's Supper, the Mass in Corinth at that time was basically a common meal that people ate together. But among the Christians in Corinth, some divisions had arisen, and St. Paul had heard about it. His intelligence was obviously pretty good. And he heard that, and this is all in the letter, that some of the Christians of Corinth came to the meal early. And they decided that they'd eat their meal first and not wait for everyone else to arrive, particularly not wait for some of the poorer members of the community to arrive, because perhaps they didn't want to be mixing with those people as much as they wanted to be mixing with the people who'd arrived on good time. Well, St. Paul wasn't impressed with this. And he said, referring to the fact that they were eating their meals separately and not waiting for others to arrive, and referring to class distinctions specifically between people, he said, "Or have you no respect for the Church of God, and would you humiliate those who have nothing? Shall I commend you for this? In this matter," he said, "I do not commend you." It's important to reflect on what he was saying. He was telling the people of Corinth that this lack of community, this lack of mutual respect in the way they celebrated the Eucharist was a definite no-no. It was not something that he would encourage or that should occur. He also, in the same letter, urged Christians of Corinth, and through them urged us, that every time we go to Mass, we should examine our consciences. He said, "But let a person look carefully at himself, and in that spirit eat the bread and drink the cup." And later on he adds, "If, however, we do scrutinize ourselves in this way, we should not be judged. We shall not be judged." For the first St. Paul, therefore, the celebration of the Eucharist was a social act. It was not just an act of individualistic piety, of people praying in a personal relationship with God, ignoring the people on either side of them. And modern theologians have also, particularly since Vatican II, opened up our minds to some of the insights that were there in Christianity always. Modern theologians have begun to develop this thought. Professor Helwig of Georgetown University, for example, described the Eucharist as a celebration of divine hospitality, welcome in the world. And she saw the Second Vatican Council as a turning point in our understanding of the Eucharist and what it was all about, what it means for how we relate to other people, and ultimately what it means for how we should engage, therefore, in community and in politics. She saw the changes that were brought about in the way the Mass is celebrated since Vatican II as moving away from a cult of what she called unquestioned mystery, reinforced in its differentness by the use of a language that most people didn't understand, Latin, before a congregation that remained passive almost throughout the entire Mass. Moving away from that to, as a result of Vatican II, a much more vigorous quest for a deeper understanding of what it was all about, through making the congregation much more actively involved, as they are now, in the Mass. And I think this is an echo of what Pope Benedict said about evangelization, when he said that evangelization isn't simply about preaching a doctrine, but it's about proclaiming that doctrine through the way we live our lives. And he went on to say that spiritual isolationism isolates the person. Spiritual individualism isolates the person. In other words, to be fully spiritual, we need to do it in the company of other people. It's a social activity, not just an individual activity. But this, in a sense, was, as far as the Vatican II's changes in the Mass were concerned, simply a formalization for a modern era of something that Christians knew intuitively for the very beginning, and which was clearly reflected in the approach to the Eucharist that had been set out, from which I quoted, by St. Paul. He was emphasizing that there should be an attitude of trust and respect between all of the people who are sharing the Eucharist together. Of course, the Eucharist is about, centrally, the changing of the bread and wine on the altar into the body and blood of Christ. a belief so radical, so amazing, that it could not but change our lives. But it's in that context, in recognition of that, because that is such an amazing thing that happens every day at Mass, that we're being asked to change our lives in a way that shows more respect, more trust, more tolerance for other people with whom we're sharing this tremendous, tremendous gift. So the Eucharist is communion with Christ and with one another. So that's how I lead my argument into the relevance of Eucharist to politics, because Eucharist is about, in part, how we relate to one another. And we've got to ask ourselves, is the relationship that we as Catholics forge with one another through politics one of justice and respect, or does it fall into some of the errors of disputationness and class distinction, which St. Paul so properly criticised among the people in Corinth so long ago? Do we bring that sense of trust and respect that we derive from the Eucharist to bear in our activity in politics? Now, of course, there are people who would say, well, religion should be kept over there and politics should be kept over there. They should have nothing to do with one another. Religion, they would say, some of these people should be kept private in case it might offend people. Very often, this is one of the words that is used. You're not supposed to have any distinctive beliefs in case they might offend somebody. Well, that's, of course, not just contrary to common sense. It's also contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights, which was brought into force in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The European Convention on Human Rights guarantees to every European the right, in its words, to manifest his religion with others in public or in private, in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. That's the European Convention on Human Rights that applies now to all the countries in Europe, not just the European Union, but all the countries in Eastern and Central Europe. Clearly, that convention does not confine religion to the private sphere. It guarantees Christians and Catholics a right to proclaim their religious beliefs in public, in the words of the convention. So, for example, a ban on religious processions of the kind that Bismarck imposed in Germany during the latter half of the 19th century would be illegal now in Europe, anywhere in Europe, under the Convention on the European Convention on Human Rights. But apart from that legal approach, I think the idea of separating religion from politics is artificial. It's artificial because people don't divide their minds into compartments. One compartment marked religious belief, another compartment marked political belief, another compartment marked personal life and how you treat other people and your family. All the values that we have in any one of these spheres of our thoughts influences the other. So it would be entirely artificial to try to say, well, you must keep the religious part of what you do separate from the rest of what you do. Indeed, if one attempted to impose that view, it would be going against what faith is, because faith of its very nature is something that should influence everything we do. Secondly, it would fail to recognize the fact that ethical beliefs are essential to any society that wants to survive. And for most people, their ethical belief system, in part at least, and sometimes in whole, derives from their religious belief. That's where they get their ethics, their ethos from. So to say that you want to separate religion from politics is to say you want to separate ethics from politics, and I don't think anybody would suggest that. But most people would suggest we don't have enough ethics in politics, not that we have too little. You may applaud if you want. I take it you're not applauding me, you're applauding the sentiment. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks also put it very well. He's the chief rabbi of England and Wales, I think. He said that we need to be bilingual. In other words, we need to be able to speak the language of faith within our religious community, in his case, the Jewish community, and we need to be able to speak the language of the common good in our engagement in the broader society. But we need to be able to speak both languages. And as we know, and heard so many people contributing to the Mass today in Irish, if you know a second language, it enriches the way you speak your first language. So we need to understand the language of political life and the language of religious life. And thirdly, the idea that this separation is nonsense, I think, derives from the fact that, well, humans are social beings. And the ethos of the society is formed through social activity. We form our ethos through engagement in sport. We learn, unfortunately, sometimes how to lose gracefully in sport. Hopefully that won't be something we'll be having to learn tonight. I'm competing with that particular event. I want to compliment you for being here. But I think your prayerful activity here will probably achieve more for the success of the team than many other activities you might be engaged in. But part of our social life is our engagement in the church. And that influences our ethos, and therefore that influences how we engage in society. So I think it's just nonsense to think to keep the two separate. In fact, all these communities, including the church, including religious education, shapes our ethos as a society. Ireland's ethos in the 21st century is what it is, in great measure, because of the tremendous contribution of religious education during the 20th century and the 19th century. And that ethos is part of the social capital of this country. And anybody who would put that social capital at risk or diminish its value or diminish our capacity to pass it on undiminished to the next generation would not be doing a favour to this country. And if you think about it, it's very difficult for a society to function at all unless it has a shared ethos of some kind. Laws aren't just obeyed because people are afraid they're going to get caught, although that sometimes does influence why they behave and why they follow the law. People follow the law because they believe in the law, because it's part of their ethos. Their belief in community and their belief in mutuality and reciprocity between people. So a shared ethos, developed through, in part, religious education, is important for ensuring that we have a law-abiding society, a society that isn't corrupt, because people have a little bell that goes off in the back of their mind to tell them that there are certain things that they shouldn't do that they might be tempted to do. It's also important to the working of the economy, the subject which is inescapable at the present time. There are so many worries about the economy. But Pope Benedict put it very well in the encyclical Caritas in Veritate when he said, "Without internal forms of solidarity and mutual trust, the market cannot fulfill its proper economic function." And today, this trust that has ceased to exist, and that loss of trust is a very great loss. If you think about that for a moment, if you do business with somebody, you trust them that they will pay you. All business, all money, all banking depends on a degree of mutual trust. But without a shared ethos in society, without a sense of values in society, we don't have the trust that's necessary for the economy to perform. And religious education has played a vital role in building an infrastructure of mutual trust in our society. And I believe that is something to which we owe religious education, for which we owe religious education a great deal. That said, that's the justification, in my view, as to why religion can't be separated from politics and why it influences politics in a good way. But what is the added value that practicing Catholics can bring into political life? First of all, I think faith in eternal life. The fact that we're not alone in the universe and that this life of ours is not something that's going to end when we die. The fact that we're here for eternity reminds us that we have a level of accountability for what we do. It also reminds us that we don't know it all, that we are very small in the great universe. It tells us that we're not alone in the universe, that there's a God, that we shouldn't be arrogant. And just as religious life should be a ceaseless search to come closer to the truth we will never know, a truth that we will never fully know, our political life should also be a humble, continued search for a truth we will never fully comprehend. I think our religious faith also teaches us that we should act in this generation we should not act in this generation with all its technologies and recent advances as if we have all the answers. Faith tells us that no matter how hard we try, we're not going to create heaven on earth as the communists and the fascists thought in the last century they could do. These totalitarian and materialist philosophies are profoundly anti-Christian, and that's why they were condemned by the Church, and that's why they were error, because they did not recognize the fact that heaven is not to be created here on this earth. Heaven is something that awaits us in the next life. Of course, Christianity doesn't offer a specific political program. It doesn't endorse one political party or another. My kingdom is not of this world, Christ said. But it does tell us that there are certain fundamental truths. And in approaching politics, we should not forget that. Opinion polls don't determine the truth of a proposition. Although sometimes when you listen to read the newspapers, you think that once people have expressed an opinion in an opinion poll, that represents absolute truth. Well, it certainly is not. Nor does the latest scientific research tell us what is absolute truth. Opinion polls are just opinion polls. Research is just research, no more. Both can and will be superseded by other polls and other research. Meanwhile, fundamental truths remain true. Truth and right are not contingent. Majorities can be wrong, and indeed often are wrong. As Cardinal Ratzinger put it when he was then Cardinal Ratzinger in his writings on the problem of threats to human life, in a world in which moral convictions lack a common reference to truth, such convictions have the value of mere opinion. And what faith brings to politics is a common reference to truth, to a sense of constantly searching for truth as something not contingent on the vagaries of opinion or the latest scientific research. In approaching political questions, a Christian must be influenced by his or her conscience, as St. Paul rather tartly reminded the Corinthians. And we also should remind us that our reason is a gift from God, and we must use it to examine our lives, our faith and our failings, to examine our conscience, to use a very old-fashioned but very relevant phrase. Maybe a more frequent, formal, public as well as private examination of conscience by individuals and by organisations, including governments, would require us to have a few less regulators, a few fewer tribunals and a few fewer inquiries. If conscience was something that we examined as a matter of automatic duty and responsibility. And since I ceased to be a diplomat and a politician, I've become a little bit involved in business, and I've become aware of a lot of work that's being done now on ethics in business. I had a very interesting briefing from a pharmaceutical company that has a very large activity here in Ireland and indeed all over the world. And of course, as you can imagine, ethics is absolutely vital in pharmaceutical research, because it's a matter of life or death. If people are making a claim or that isn't well founded in order to make a profit selling a drug, and something happens afterwards that damages patients, that is an absolute disaster for everybody, for the patient and for, of course, the company. So pharmaceutical companies put a tremendous amount of effort into this. And I was attended a seminar, in fact, which went on for a day and a half, where they were focusing on how can they make the company at every level more ethically conscious, so that it didn't make mistakes. Essentially, it all boiled down to saying that everybody individually and in groups in their particular laboratory or whatever, they should examine their conscience every month or every year or whatever, on a regular basis. They should re-examine their conscience all the time, that they're not doing anything, that they're not being led by peer pressure, or they're not being led by competitive forces to, in any sense, lower their standards. And I think this shows us the eternal truth and verity of that Christian practice. As St. Paul said to the Corinthians, if we scrutinize ourselves, we will not be judged. Our faith and our conscience, I think, should also tell us in political life that we should respect God's creation. We should not pass on this earth in a less good condition to the next generation than we inherited it from the last. That's a Christian thought as well. Our faith also tells us, and these are all things I think that faith brings to politics, values that it adds to politics. Our faith also tells us that God created each one of us as individuals. We're not mere accidents of genetics, and that He cares for each one of us as individuals. Our life comes from Him, and it is not ours. Our life is not ours to manipulate or to take away. And this is not a belief that we can put aside in approaching politics. Just as human rights are not contingent on the vagaries of opinion, nor are questions of the value of human life to be contingent on the vagaries of opinion. I think the whole concept of human rights really has a Christian root. In fact, if you were to study the origin of the preparation of the European Convention, you would see that it was active Christian Catholics and Protestants who contributed to it. And the idea that individuals have human rights comes, in a sense, from the insight that Christians have that each individual is created individually by God. That we're not just a collective mass, a nation, or a race to be manipulated, moved around, or mistreated, or elevated. A belief that we're each of us as individuals, the creation of God, makes it reasonable and essential to respect the right to life from conception to natural death. And equally importantly, because we respect every individual life, to spend our money in better off countries in ensuring that easily curable diseases like malaria that cause children to die prematurely should, with our money and our support, be eliminated. Just as a human being who has not yet been born has a claim on our responsibility, so also does a child living on another continent that we have never met either have a claim on our responsibility. All of this comes from the understanding that we have that each of us has been created individually by God. Our faith tells us, as I said, that we do not pass away into nothingness and our lives end, and that we do have to give an account of ourselves. I referred to conscience already. It tells us also that science and material progress are only means to an end and no more. They're not why we're here on earth. The gross national product or the gross domestic product doesn't measure the success of a society. The pursuit of knowledge is indeed an expression of the creative gift that God has given each of us, but it is not an end in itself. We're not on earth simply that we may know more. And that's why it's right that there should be ethical limitations placed on scientific research. The pursuit of knowledge is not an end in itself. It has to be guided by ethical considerations. Furthermore, for the health of any society, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that our faith helps us in moments of great trial to answer the fundamental questions, the answer to which may well be, for some of us in desperate circumstances, the difference between continuing to live and choosing not to do so. Faith answers questions like, what's the meaning of life? Why am I here? What's the value of my life? If you had no faith, you might think, as I said, that your life was something that you could simply sweep aside. But I think faith in society helps us to get through the difficult moments, to continue living, and to emerge through the clouds to the high uplands of a happier life later on. Our faith as Catholics also, I think, should help us, and I say this particularly as Catholics, should help us in our relationship with other nations. The very word Catholic, universal, reminds us that our obligations are to everybody in the world, not just to our own family, not just to our own nation. Indeed, if you take the two words Catholicism and nationalism, they actually mean the opposite, the one of the other. And Pope Pius XI reminded us as well in 1922, just after the end of the First World War. He said that even patriotism must be kept within the laws of Christ. Well, I think the great error of the second half of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th, is that it elevated patriotism above the laws of Christ. Millions and millions of people died because of that mistake. Our faith also tells us that we should follow the example of Christ and forgive others who have wronged us. Now, forgiveness is not something that comes naturally. In fact, forgiveness is against our nature. But we do it. We do it as Christians because we believe Christ died so that we, in our turn, might be forgiven. And because he told us that in our turn, we must forgive others. We must deplore the sin, but we should not shun the sinner. And I would add as well that vengeance does not cure the injury to victims. Sometimes vengeance makes it worse. Retribution is not Christ's way. No, that hard and unnatural thing, forgiveness, is Christ's way. And I believe it would help modern Ireland a great deal with its record prison population. I think there are something like 10 times as many people in prison in Ireland in 2012 as there were in prison in Ireland in 1912. It would help this society that wants to blame people so much, wants to punish people so much, wants somebody to be the one responsible for whatever ill we are suffering at the present time, to remember the meaning of Christ's life: forgiveness, letting go, and rising again. In that context, I would say, and I refer in particular to penal policy here, penalties are of course necessary to ensure that laws are respected. And they may involve terms of imprisonment. We should take no pleasure in seeing anyone imprisoned. And these penalties should be calculated by reference to the need for deterrence and for restitution to society, but not ever as a form of vengeance or indeed as a form of catharsis for the victims. I have noticed in debates about criminal cases now, increasingly people are being asked, as victims of a crime, are you satisfied with the sentence that that person has got? Well, the underlying value in that question is that essentially the legal system is there to present a victim with a form of vengeance, but he is or she is satisfied that the person who injured them has been injured enough in return. That's not Christ's way. That's not the way in which law was originally formed. It's not the law that I learned when I studied law in the 1960s, but it has become, in our media-driven society, the way in which increasingly criminal cases are being examined, as if there were a process at the end of which victims should feel vindicated because they have had vengeance on those who have been. That's not Christ's way. And I hope that this Eucharistic Congress will be part of a rediscovery of the older understandings of what crime and punishment should really be about. I'd back up this point, if I may, by quoting from an article by Michael Gerson in the Washington Post on the death recently of a former Watergate convict, Chuck Colson. He was the guy, he was imprisoned for obstruction of justice. He was one of President Nixon's close associates in the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover. Well, he was jailed for obstruction of justice and he was released after 3 or 4 years. And on his release, he decided to devote his life to evangelical Christianity and in particular to the improvement of prison conditions. Now, writing an obituary for him, Michael Gerson, who's a Catholic commentator, said, and I quote, "Prison often figures large in conversion stories. Pride is the enemy of grace, and prison the enemy of pride. How else," he quoted, "how else but through a broken heart may the Lord Christ enter in," wrote Oscar Wilde after he had been released from Reading jail. It is a central paradox of Christianity that fulfillment starts in emptiness, that streams emerge in the desert, that freedom can be found in a prison cell. These are some of the insights, I think, that Christianity can bring to political life. Christian belief is, I believe, very important to living in the 21st century in the globalized world. In Caritas in Veritate, Pope referred to the phenomenon of globalization. How globalization, because people and money can move easily from one jurisdiction to the other, has helped make society more unequal because it's not possible to have progressive taxation because people can escape those taxes by moving themselves or their money to another jurisdiction. And our society has become, the more globalized it has become, the more prosperous it has become, the more unequal it has also become. And I think the remedy to that has to be through a changing in the ethic of our society. It's not going to be solved by laws, by the French demanding that Ireland get rid of its corporate tax rate or by someone else introducing regulations to govern what's happening in X or Y country. It's going to be changed by changing the ethos of our society. So that shareholders don't demand that they get the top chief executive and that he's paid 10 times what anyone else is paid in the company, but they say that we want a company that works as a community and therefore there should be some fair relationship between what the person at the top gets and what others get in society. Changing the ethos of society is something that I think Christians bringing their faith into politics can achieve. Drawing on our faith, I think we can help society to work out through politics a strong ethos of mutual trust and respect. Trust and respect within religious communities, and I hope that that's something that we will remember we should, as Irish Catholics, promote within our own church as well, because sometimes even that begins to diminish. Trust between religious communities and respect between religious communities, the one with the other. Trust between believers and non-believers, and respect for non-believers. Trust and respect in business and economic relations, and trust and respect between nations. These are the things that our faith has to offer politics. Therefore, I think we should not be behind the door in proclaiming our religious belief as we engage ourselves in political debate.